The morning of September the 20th, 1854, dawned cold and grey over the Alma River in Crimea. As British soldiers of the Light Division formed their ranks on the valley floor, they presented a sight that would have been instantly recognisable to any soldier from the previous century. Scarlet coats arranged in perfect lines, 2 ranks deep, stretching across the battlefield like a red carpet unrolled for war. The officers wore their dress uniforms, complete with plumed shakos and polished brass that caught what little sunlight pierced the clouds. Regimental colours snapped in the breeze, their silk embroidered with battle honours from Waterloo, from the Peninsula, from conflicts stretching back generations. This was how European armies had fought for 150 years, in ordered ranks with parade ground precision, where courage and discipline mattered more than cover or concealment, where officers led from the front because their men needed to see them, needed to follow their example into the storm of musket fire, where artillery fired solid shot that bounced across open fields, where cavalry charged in massive formations, where infantry stood shoulder to shoulder and traded volleys at ranges so close you could see the whites of your enemy's eyes. But something was different that morning. As the British advanced up the slopes toward the Russian positions, something changed in the fundamental nature of warfare that morning, though few recognised it at the time. The Russian artillery wasn't firing solid shot. They were firing explosive shells from rifled guns that detonated overhead, spraying shrapnel across entire formations. The Russian infantry wasn't armed with smoothbore muskets effective to maybe 100 yards on a good day. They carried percussion cap rifles that could kill at 400 yards, could wound at 600. The mathematics of warfare had changed, but the tactics had not, and men died because of it. The Battle of the Alma was a British victory, but it cost 2,000 casualties in a few hours. The French lost 600. The Russians lost 5,000. These weren't the casualties of a day-long Napoleonic bloodbath like Borodino or Leipzig. This was a relatively minor engagement, a preliminary action in a campaign that was just beginning. Yet the death toll approached that of major battles from the previous generation. Something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between weapons and tactics, between technology and tradition, between the old way of war and whatever was coming next. The old way of war, the early modern system of warfare that had dominated European battlefields from roughly 1650 to 1850, was dying. It would take another 60 years and 2 world wars before it finally expired completely. But the seeds of its destruction were already germinating in the Crimean mud. This is the story of how warfare transformed from an activity that Frederick the Great would have recognised into something that would have been alien to him. How the clash of colourful armies on our open fields gave way to the grinding attrition of trenches and barbed wire. How warfare stopped being a contest of discipline and courage and became an industrial process of systematic destruction. The early modern way of war was built on limitations. The smoothbore musket, which remained essentially unchanged from 1700 to 1840, was an inherently inaccurate weapon. A trained soldier could fire perhaps 3 rounds per minute. The bullet, a round ball of soft lead, tumbled through the air without spin, following an unpredictable path. At 100 yards, an individual soldier had perhaps a 30% chance of hitting a man-sized target. At 200 yards, that dropped to 10%. Beyond 300 yards, you were essentially wasting ammunition. These limitations shaped everything about how armies fought. If individual muskets were inaccurate, you needed mass. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in lines 2 or 3 ranks deep. The first rank knelt, the second stood, creating a wall of muskets all aimed at the enemy formation. When hundreds of muskets fired simultaneously, the individual inaccuracy didn't matter. Enough bullets would hit the target. Volume of fire compensated for lack of precision. The tactics were simple because they had to be. Soldiers weren't professional warriors. Most were conscripts or the poor and desperate seeking a steady meal. They received minimal training, just enough to load and fire their muskets, to march in formation, to respond to drum signals and shouted commands. Complex tactics were impossible. The only thing that worked was drill, endless repetitive drill, until men could load and fire and march without thinking, could maintain formation under fire through muscle memory and fear of the sergeants behind them with their halberds and spontoons. Officers led from the front not from bravery alone, but from necessity. In the chaos and smoke of a black powder battlefield, with vision reduced to a few dozen yards, with the roar of musketry drowning out all sound, visual command was the only command. Soldiers followed the regimental colours, followed their officers on horseback, followed the men beside them. Break the formation and you broke the unit. Break the unit and the battle was lost. Artillery in the early modern period was similarly limited. Cannon fired solid iron balls that were most effective against massed formations. The cannon ball would strike the ground and bounce, skipping through ranks of infantry like a stone across water, decapitating men, tearing limbs, creating bloody paths through the formations. But the cannon were heavy, difficult to move, slow to reload. A well-trained crew might manage 2 shots per minute, 3 if they were exceptional, and the gun didn't overheat. The maximum effective range was perhaps 1,000 yards for a heavy piece, less for lighter field guns, and the solid shot, while devastating when it hit, left no lasting effect on the battlefield itself. Once fired, it was just another piece of metal, lying on the ground. Cavalry remained decisive because infantry were so vulnerable. A formation of men standing shoulder to shoulder, armed with weapons that took 20 seconds to reload, could be swept away by mounted troops. The only defence was discipline. Infantry had to stand firm, had to maintain their formation, had to present a hedge of bayonets that horses would refuse to charge. The psychology of cavalry combat was as important as the physical impact. Men who broke and ran would be sabred down. Men who stood firm would often see the cavalry veer away at the last moment, horses refusing to impale themselves on the waiting steel. This system of warfare, born in the musket and pike formations of the 30 Years' War, perfected by Marlborough and Frederick the Great, brought to its apex by Napoleon, was as much about morale and discipline as about killing. Battles were won when one side's formations broke, when soldiers decided they'd had enough and fled. The actual casualties in most early modern battles were relatively modest until one side broke. Then the slaughter began as cavalry pursued and cut down fleeing infantry, who had abandoned their formations and thus their only protection. The Napoleonic Wars represented the perfection of this system. Napoleon understood that morale was decisive. His tactics focused on breaking enemy morale through combination of artillery, infantry and cavalry, applied with perfect timing to shatter enemy formations at their weakest point. The massive casualties of Napoleonic battles, and they were massive by the standards of the age, came not from the firefights but from the routs, from the pursuit, from men being cut down as they ran. But the Industrial Revolution was already changing the fundamental tools of warfare, and with them, the basic nature of combat itself. The changes came gradually, each seeming minor in isolation, but collectively they represented a transformation as profound as the invention of gunpowder. The first change was the rifle. The concept was old. Cutting spiral grooves inside a gun barrel rifling made the bullet spin, which stabilized its flight and dramatically improved accuracy. A rifled weapon could hit targets at 3 or 4 times the range of a smoothbore. The problem was loading. The bullet had to fit tightly in the barrel to engage the rifling, which made it nearly impossible to load quickly. Riflemen in early modern armies were specialists, skirmishers who fought in loose formations, taking aimed shots at officers and breaking up enemy formations before the main lines engaged. But they were too few and too slow firing to be decisive. The solution came in the 1840s with the Minié ball, named after French Army Captain Claude-Étienne Minié. The Minié ball was cylindrical with a hollow base. When fired, the explosion of powder expanded the hollow base, forcing it to engage the rifling. This meant the bullet could be loaded as quickly as a round ball in a smoothbore, but would achieve the accuracy of a rifle. Suddenly you could arm entire armies with weapons accurate to 400 yards or more, weapons that could be loaded and fired 3 times per minute, weapons that made the old smoothbore musket obsolete overnight. The implications were profound, but military establishments were slow to recognise them. The rifle arrived gradually. The British adopted the Minié rifle in the early 1850s, just in time for the Crimean War. The French followed. Other armies experimented, but the tactics didn't change. Armies still fought in the old formations because that's what officers knew, what they'd trained for, what their tactical manuals prescribed. The result was slaughter. The Crimean War should have been the wake-up call. At the Battle of Inkerman in November 1854, fought in dense fog that reduced visibility to yards, British infantry with Minié rifles massacred Russian columns advancing in the old close-order formations. Russian casualties exceeded 12,000 against British losses of 2,500. The rifle had made the old attack columns suicidal. But the lesson wasn't learned, or rather, It was learned imperfectly, interpreted through the lens of traditional thinking. Artillery was transforming even more dramatically. The development of rifled artillery in the 1850s increased both range and accuracy. A smoothbore cannon might hit a target at 1,000 yards if the gunners were skilled and lucky. A rifled gun could reliably hit targets at 3,000 yards, could place shells with precision, could engage formations beyond the range of any infantry weapon. Even more significant was the development of reliable explosive shells. Explosive shells weren't new, they dated back centuries. But early shells were unreliable and dangerous. They consisted of hollow iron spheres filled with gunpowder, with a fuse that was supposed to ignite from the cannon's discharge and detonate the shell at the target. But fuses were unpredictable. Shells exploded prematurely, destroying the gun and killing the crew. Or they failed to explode at all. Solid shot was more reliable, more predictable, and thus preferred for most purposes. The invention of reliable percussion fuses in the 1840s changed this. Shells that detonated on impact or after a predetermined time meant artillery could deliver explosive force precisely where it was needed. A shell exploding above an infantry formation would spray shrapnel across a wide area, killing or wounding dozens of men with a single round. Artillery no longer just punched holes in formations, it could destroy them entirely, could turn entire regiments into casualty lists with a few minutes of sustained fire. But perhaps the most significant technological change was the railroad. Railroads transformed the strategic level of warfare in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until the American Civil War and the Prussian Wars of Unification. Armies had always been limited by logistics, by how much food and ammunition they could carry, by how fast they could march. An army might cover 15 miles a day on good roads, less in bad weather or rough terrain. Supplying that army required enormous wagon trains that moved even slower and consumed much of the food they carried just feeding the horses and drivers. Railroads changed this equation fundamentally. Troops could move hundreds of miles in a day. Supplies could flow continuously from depots to the front. Armies that would have taken weeks to concentrate could assemble in days. The scale of warfare expanded dramatically. Battles that might have involved 50,000 men in the Napoleonic era could now involve 200,000 or more. The duration of campaigns extended from weeks to months to years because railroads could sustain armies indefinitely in the field. The telegraph, invented in the 1840s and spreading rapidly by the 1850s, similarly transformed command and control. Generals could communicate with their armies over hundreds of miles instantly. Intelligence about enemy movements could reach headquarters in minutes rather than days. This should have enabled more sophisticated strategy, better coordination, faster responses to changing situations. In practice, it often meant more micromanagement, more confusion, more contradictory orders as senior commanders tried to control battles from hundreds of miles away. These technological changes, rifles and rifled artillery and railroads and telegraphs, should have forced a complete rethinking of tactics and strategy. They should have made it obvious that the old ways of war were obsolete. But military thinking is conservative by nature and by necessity. Officers train for years to master the existing system. Their careers, their reputations, their entire professional identity is built on expertise in how things are done. Admitting that all of that is suddenly obsolete, that everything they know is wrong, is psychologically and professionally devastating. So they don't. They adapt incrementally, they interpret new technologies through old frameworks, they convince themselves that the fundamental principles haven't changed, only the details. This is why the Crimean War, which should have demonstrated the obsolescence of early modern tactics, instead was interpreted as confirming traditional principles. Yes, casualties were higher, yes, rifles were more effective, but the British still won when they advanced in line, still lost when their formations broke. The French still relied on attacking columns, the Russians still massed their infantry, the tactical vocabulary hadn't changed, so observers convinced themselves the grammar of war remained the same. The American Civil War, beginning in 1861, should have shattered these illusions. Here was a war fought with rifles and rifled artillery, with railroads and telegraphs, on a scale that dwarfed European conflicts, and the casualties were unprecedented. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 produced 23,000 casualties in a single day. Single day, the bloodiest single day in American history before or since. Gettysburg in July 1863 resulted in 51,000 casualties over 3 days. These weren't the casualties of Napoleonic battle, where most losses came from the pursuit. These were men shot down in formation, torn apart by artillery, killed by weapons that could strike at ranges where the enemy was barely visible. And yet, European military observers watching the American Civil War largely dismissed it as irrelevant. The armies were composed of amateurs, they said, citizen soldiers rather than professionals. The tactics were crude, the generalship mediocre. European armies would never be so wasteful of their men's lives. European discipline and training would prevent such slaughter. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they wouldn't discover that for another 50 years. The Prussian Wars of Unification, fought between 1864 and 1871, provided more evidence that warfare had fundamentally changed. The Prussian army under Helmuth von Moltke demonstrated that railroads could be used for rapid mobilization and strategic concentration. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, Prussia mobilized and concentrated faster than Austria, achieving strategic surprise despite Austria's larger army. The war lasted 7 weeks. The decisive Battle of Königgrätz lasted 1 day and produced 45,000 casualties, with Austrian losses more than double Prussia's. But the real lesson of Königgrätz wasn't about railroads or mobilization. It was about weapons. The Prussians were armed with the Dries needle gun, an early breech-loading rifle that could be fired from a prone position and loaded much faster than muzzle-loading rifles. The Austrians had muzzle-loading rifles that required standing to reload. The Prussian advantage in rate of fire and the ability to fire from cover was decisive. Austrian infantry advancing in traditional formations were massacred by Prussians firing from prone positions at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 reinforced these lessons with even higher casualties. The French had better rifles, the chassepot, which outranged the Prussian needle gun. But the Prussians had better artillery, the Krupp breech-loading steel cannons that could fire faster and more accurately than the French bronze muzzle loaders. And critically, the Prussians had better strategy, better logistics, better use of railroads and telegraphs to concentrate forces and coordinate movements. The result was a series of bloody battles where both sides learned that attacking prepared positions was suicidal, where artillery dominated the battlefield, where infantry huddled in whatever cover they could find and died in shocking numbers when they tried to advance. The Battle of Gravelotte-Saint-Privet in August 1870 produced 33,000 casualties. The Siege of Paris starved a city of 2 million for 4 months. The war introduced franc-tireurs, civilian guerrillas who ignored the rules of civilized warfare and were shot as criminals. The war ended with German unification, French humiliation, and casualty figures that shocked Europe. But still the fundamental lesson wasn't learned. Yes, everyone agreed weapons were more lethal. Yes, casualties were higher. But the solution, military thinkers concluded, wasn't to abandon offensive tactics. The solution was to advance faster, to close with the enemy before defensive fire became decisive, to rely on morale and elan to carry troops through the danger zone. The cult of the offensive was born from the bloodbaths of the 1860s and 1870s, a desperate attempt to preserve the romantic vision of warfare as a contest of courage and will, rather than accepting that it had become an industrial process of systematic killing. The technological evolution continued accelerating. The 1880s brought smokeless powder, which eliminated the dense clouds of smoke that had characterized black powder battlefields for centuries. Suddenly, soldiers could see the entire battlefield, could aim at targets hundreds of yards away without waiting for the wind to clear the smoke. This should have made old tactics even more suicidal. In practice, it enabled even longer-range engagements, even more lethal defensive fire. Magazine rifles appeared in the 1880s and 1890s, weapons that could fire 10 or 15 rounds before reloading. The British Lee Metford, the German Gewehr 88, the French Lepel, the Russian Mosin Nagant, all were magazine rifles with ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, and rates of fire that turned trained infantry into the equivalent of machine guns. A British infantryman with a Lee Enfield could fire 15 aim shots per minute, could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards consistently, could wound at 1,000 yards or more. An infantry company of 100 men could deliver 500 rounds per minute of accurate fire. No infantry formation could advance through that, and then came the actual machine guns. The Maxim gun, invented in 1884, could fire 600 rounds per minute, could sustain fire for minutes at a time, could sweep entire formations with an arc of bullets that nothing could survive. A single Maxim gun had the firepower of 40 riflemen. A few machine guns in prepared positions could stop entire battalions. The machine gun made every defensive position a fortress, made every attack a potential suicide mission. Artillery continued its evolution toward longer ranges and more devastating shells. Quick-firing field guns with recoil mechanisms appeared in the 1890s. The French 75mm gun, the 75, could fire 15 rounds per minute, could place shells on target 5 miles away, could deliver explosive force with unprecedented precision. Heavy artillery, the big siege guns, could fire shells weighing hundreds of pounds at ranges of 10 miles or more, could reduce fortifications to rubble, could create devastation that had previously been impossible. But the most significant change wasn't any single weapon. It was the cumulative effect of all these developments on the fundamental relationship between offense and defense. Every technological advance increased defensive firepower more than offensive capability. Rifles and machine guns could kill attackers long before they could close to effective range. Artillery could target attacking formations before they even reached the main defensive line. Barbed wire, invented for farming in the 1870s and adapted for military use in the 1890s, created barriers that slowed attacking infantry to a crawl, holding them in the killing zone while defenders poured fire into them. By 1900, the balance of warfare had shifted decisively toward the defense. Any prepared position with rifles, machine guns, and artillery, protected by barbed wire and field fortifications, was nearly impregnable to direct assault. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Defenders behind cover with modern weapons could kill attackers at rates that made success impossible, without overwhelming numerical superiority and willingness to accept catastrophic casualties. European armies saw the evidence in colonial wars at the turn of the century. At Omdurman in 1898, British forces armed with Maxim guns and magazine rifles massacred 10,000 Sudanese warriors, while suffering only 47 dead. The disparity was so extreme it seemed to confirm European technological superiority and racial theories rather than demonstrating the power of modern defensive weapons. At Spionkop in 1900 during the Second Boer War, British infantry advancing uphill against entrenched Boers with magazine rifles suffered 250 dead and 500 wounded in a single day. The Boers lost minimal casualties. The lesson was clear. Attacking prepared positions was suicidal. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05 provided even starker evidence. Here were two modern armies, both equipped with magazine rifles, machine guns, and quick-firing artillery, fighting on open terrain with railroad logistics and telegraph communications. The result was unprecedented carnage. The Battle of Mukden in March 1905 involved over 600,000 troops and lasted 10 days. Casualties exceeded 150,000. The daily casualty rate approached 15,000, higher than any battle in human history up to that point. The siege of Port Arthur demonstrated what modern defensive weapons could do. Russian positions fortified with machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery held off Japanese assaults for months. Japanese casualties in repeated attacks exceeded 60,000. When the fortress finally fell, the Russian garrison had been starved into submission, not defeated by assault. European military observers studied the siege carefully and drew exactly the wrong conclusion. The Japanese had succeeded through courage and determination, through willingness to accept casualties, through the offensive spirit. Never mind that they'd lost 60,000 men taking a position defended by 40,000. The lesson, European generals decided, was that the offensive remained, supreme if troops had sufficient morale and aggressive spirit. This cognitive dissonance, this refusal to accept what the evidence clearly showed, came from multiple sources. Professional military establishments were deeply invested in existing doctrine. Admitting that attacking had become nearly impossible would require completely rethinking tactics, strategy, training, everything. The entire culture of military service, built around aggressive offensive action and personal courage, would have to change. Generals couldn't accept that battles might no longer be decided by the elan of attacking infantry or the shock of cavalry charges, but by machine guns and barbed wire. There was also a political dimension. Defensive warfare meant long, grinding campaigns of attrition. It meant accepting that future wars would be industrial processes decided by which side could produce more weapons and sustain more casualties. For nations like France, still smarting from defeat in 1870 and determined to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, this was unacceptable. They needed to believe in the possibility of quick, decisive victory through aggressive offensive action. The alternative, that future wars would be slow attrition battles that devastated entire generations, was too horrible to contemplate. So when war came in August 1914, European armies marched to battle with tactics that would have been recognisable to Napoleon. Infantry attacked in massed formations, cavalry prepared to exploit breakthroughs, artillery supported advances with preparatory bombardments, officers led from the front in dress uniforms with polished buttons and ceremonial swords. Bands played martial music as troops marched toward the front. This was war as it had been fought for centuries, war as professional soldiers understood it, war as national cultures celebrated it. The reality struck within weeks. The Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914 produced over 300,000 French casualties in 2 weeks. 2 weeks! The French attacked in dense formations, infantry advancing in waves, officers leading with drawn swords, troops maintaining formation as they'd been trained. German machine guns and artillery destroyed them. Entire regiments ceased to exist in a matter of hours. The 15th Corps lost 11,000 men in a single day at Mohanga. The casualties from 2 weeks of fighting exceeded the total French losses in the entire Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. The Germans fared little better. Their planned offensive through Belgium and into France, the Schlieffen Plan, called for massive flanking movements and decisive battles of annihilation. But they discovered that railroads made strategic mobility possible, while machine guns made tactical mobility impossible. They could concentrate forces rapidly, but once concentrated, those forces struggled to advance against even minimal prepared defences. At Mons in August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force, numbering only 70,000 men, delayed the German advance for an entire day through disciplined rifle fire. German troops advancing in formation were cut down so quickly that British soldiers later reported they thought their opponents were drunk, unable to understand why German infantry would continue advancing into obvious death. By September 1914, the mobile war of manoeuvre had ground to a halt. Both sides discovered that stopping was easier than advancing. Infantry with rifles and machine guns, supported by artillery, could hold positions against forces many times their size. The only safe response to enemy fire was to dig in, to create trenches and fortifications, to establish defensive lines that couldn't be frontally assaulted. Within weeks, those defensive lines stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel. The Western Front was born, and with it the death of early modern warfare. The trenches represented the complete negation of everything early modern warfare had stood for. There were no colourful formations, no parade ground precision, no cavalry charges, no decisive battles where courage and discipline could achieve victory in a single day. There was only mud and barbed wire and machine guns, men living like rats in underground warrens, attacks that gained yards at the cost of thousands of lives, artillery bombardments that could last for days and pulverise entire landscapes into cratered moonscapes. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 represented perhaps the ultimate demonstration of how completely warfare had changed. The British and French attacked German positions that had been fortified for 2 years. They prepared with a week-long artillery bombardment that fired over 1.7 million shells. They attacked with 750,000 men against perhaps 200,000 German defenders. On the first day, July 1st, 1916, British forces suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. 19,000 dead in a single day. Some battalions lost 90% of their strength in the first hour. The attack continued for 4 months and ultimately advanced the front line by about 6 miles, at the cost of over 600,000 British and French casualties and perhaps 500,000 German casualties. This wasn't warfare as Frederick the Great or Napoleon or Wellington would have recognised it. This was industrial slaughter, a battle of attrition where victory went not to the side with better tactics or braver soldiers, but to whichever side could sustain horrific losses longer. The weapons had made traditional tactics obsolete, but no one had figured out what should replace them. So armies just kept attacking, kept feeding men into the machine guns and artillery, kept sacrificing divisions to gain positions that had no strategic value, kept grinding away at each other in the desperate hope that the other side would break first. Verdun in 1916 was even worse in some ways. The Germans attacked not to achieve any strategic objective, but explicitly to bleed France white. to kill so many French soldiers that France would be forced to accept a negotiated peace. The battle lasted 10 months, casualties approached 700,000, the front lines barely moved. But the psychological impact was devastating. Verdun became a symbol of the futility and horror of modern warfare, of how completely the old way of war had died. The old way of war, the early modern system that had lasted for 200 years, was built on limitations that made warfare comprehensible, that made battles decisive, that made courage and discipline decisive factors. Those limitations were gone. Rifles could kill at ranges where men were barely visible. Machine guns could fire thousands of rounds per minute. Artillery could deliver explosives with precision across miles. Barbed wire could create impassable barriers. Railroads could sustain armies indefinitely. The telegraph could coordinate operations across hundreds of miles. These technologies should have made warfare more efficient, should have made battles shorter and more decisive. Instead, they made warfare into a grinding attrition, where the only way to break a defensive line was to accept casualties that would have been inconceivable in earlier eras. They made every position defensible and every attack suicidal. They turned warfare from a clash of armies into an industrial process of systematic destruction, where entire generations were fed into the machine and emerged as casualty statistics. By 1918, when the war finally ended, over 10 million soldiers were dead and 20 million wounded. Entire nations had been bled white. The demographic impacts would echo for generations. And for what? The war settled little, created new problems, and planted the seeds for an even more destructive conflict 20 years later. The early modern way of war died in the trenches of the Western Front, killed by technologies that made its tactics obsolete, and by military establishments that couldn't or wouldn't adapt until forced to by horrific casualties. The colourful armies, the parade ground precision, the cavalry charges, the decisive battles, all of it was swept away by machine guns and barbed wire. What replaced it was something darker, more mechanical, more destructive. Warfare had become an industrial process, and the men who fought it were raw material to be processed and consumed in the pursuit of objectives that often made no sense. The old way of war had its horrors, but it had its glories too. There was courage and sacrifice and honour. There was the possibility that a great general or a brave soldier could change the course of a battle. There was meaning in the struggle. Modern warfare, the new way of war born in the trenches, had only horror. Individual courage mattered little when machine guns fired thousands of rounds per minute. Great generals couldn't change reality when attacking meant crossing barbed wire under artillery fire. The meaning was lost in the industrial scale of the killing. The transformation from early modern warfare to modern total war took 60 years, from the Crimean War to World War I. In that time, every aspect of warfare changed. The weapons, the tactics, the strategy, the scale, the casualties, the very nature of what it meant to be a soldier. The old way of war, for all its flaws, was at least comprehensible. Men understood why they were fighting, what they were fighting for, how battles were won and lost. The new way of war was incomprehensible horror, industrial slaughter on a scale that defied understanding. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighters in 1943. By 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. In the same way, European generals had dismissed the evidence that warfare had fundamentally changed. By 1918, there were no European generals who could still believe in the old way of war. The thunder had spoken, and the age of colourful armies and decisive battles was over. What came after was something darker, and the world has never fully recovered. The armistice of November 1918 should have prompted a complete rethinking of military doctrine. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 4 years of industrial slaughter had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the old tactical systems were dead. Yet in the aftermath of World War I, military establishments across Europe engaged in a peculiar form of selective memory, choosing to remember the final months of mobile warfare in 1918 while conveniently forgetting the 4 years of static horror that preceded them. The German Spring Offensive of 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, had briefly restored mobility to the Western Front through new infiltration tactics. Small groups of stormtroopers, armed with light machine guns, grenades and flamethrowers, bypassed strong points and penetrated deep into Allied lines. The attacks gained more ground in days than previous offensives had achieved in months. German forces advanced 40 miles, threatening Paris, creating panic in Allied capitals. Here, many generals concluded, was proof that the offensive spirit could still prevail, that proper tactics could overcome defensive firepower. But the Kaiserschlacht had ultimately failed. The Germans advanced too far, too fast, outrunning their supplies and artillery support. When the Allies counterattacked in August 1918, using tanks and aircraft in coordinated combined arms operations, the German army collapsed. The lesson wasn't that offensive spirit had triumphed. The lesson was that new technologies, tanks and aircraft, and improved artillery coordination had finally provided tools to break the defensive stalemate. But that's not how most military establishments interpreted it. The French army, which had suffered the most in the trenches, drew the opposite conclusion from everyone else. They became obsessed with defence. The Maginot Line, that massive chain of fortifications built along the German border in the 1930s, represented the ultimate expression of defensive thinking taken to its logical extreme. Concrete fortifications armed with artillery and machine guns protected by anti-tank obstacles and minefields, garrisoned by troops who could hold indefinitely against any assault. The Maginot Line was the trench system perfected, made permanent, rendered impregnable, or so they thought. The British Army, traumatised by the Somme and Passchendaele, retreated into colonial policing. Small wars against poorly armed opponents in far-flung corners of the empire didn't require confronting the reality of modern warfare. The tank, which British forces had pioneered in 1916 and used effectively in 1918, was relegated to supporting infantry rather than being developed as an independent offensive weapon. Theories about mechanised warfare, about fast-moving tank formations supported by aircraft, were discussed but not seriously implemented. The cavalry remained, absurdly, a major component of the British Army through the 1930s. The German army, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from maintaining large forces or modern weapons, paradoxically became the most innovative. Freed from the weight of tradition and establishment thinking, German officers like Heinz Guderian studied the lessons of 1918 and developed theories of mobile warfare that would have been heretical in more conservative establishments. The tank shouldn't support infantry, Guderian argued. Infantry should support tanks. Mechanised formations combining tanks, motorised infantry, and self-propelled artillery, all coordinated by radio and supported by aircraft, could achieve breakthrough and exploitation in ways that had been impossible in World War I. The concept wasn't entirely new. British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart had proposed similar ideas. The Soviets under Tukhachevsky developed a deep battle doctrine with similar principles. But only the Germans, rebuilding their military from scratch in the 1930s, actually implemented these theories fully. The panzer divisions created in the mid-1930s were revolutionary organisations, combining tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers and air support into integrated formations designed for rapid mobile warfare. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provided a testing ground for new military technologies and doctrines. German and Italian forces supporting Franco's nationalists, Soviet forces supporting the Republicans, all experimented with tanks, aircraft and combined arms tactics. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937, where German aircraft destroyed a town and killed hundreds of civilians, demonstrated the terror potential of strategic bombing. Tank battles around Madrid and Teruel showed both the potential and limitations of armoured warfare. But the lessons were ambiguous, and each nation interpreted them through their own doctrinal prejudices. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the world discovered that warfare had evolved yet again. The Polish army, still organised along World War I principles with horse cavalry and infantry, divisions was systematically destroyed in 5 weeks. Not by superior numbers, the Polish army was actually larger, but by superior mobility and coordination. German panzer divisions sliced through Polish positions, bypassing strong points, encircling entire armies, creating chaos in the Polish rear areas. Dive bombers, the infamous Stukas, provided close air support, destroying Polish communications and command centres. The Poles fought bravely, but they were fighting yesterday's war while the Germans had invented tomorrow's. The conquest of France in May and June 1940 shocked the world even more profoundly. France possessed the largest army in Europe, modern tanks that were in many ways superior to German models, strong fortifications and defensive positions they'd spent years preparing. The Maginot Line was exactly what military theory said it should be, an impregnable barrier, and it worked perfectly. German forces couldn't break through, so they went around it. On May 10, 1940, German forces attacked through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French had considered impassable for large mechanized forces. 7 panzer divisions, over 2,000 tanks, pushed through the forest roads in massive columns that stretched for miles. They crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, breaking through French positions that were lightly held because everyone knew the real threat was further north where the Maginot Line ended. Within 4 days, German armoured spearheads had advanced 50 miles, reaching the English Channel and cutting the Allied armies in two. The speed was unprecedented. In World War I, an advance of 50 miles would have taken months and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. In 1940, it took 4 days. The French army, with its World War I doctrine of methodical battle and coordinated advances, couldn't react fast enough. By the time French commanders understood what was happening and organised counterattacks, the German spearheads had already moved on. French tanks, operating in small groups supporting infantry, were defeated piecemeal by German panzer divisions that concentrated overwhelming force at decisive points. The French campaign lasted 6 weeks. French casualties exceeded 90,000 dead and 200,000 wounded. German casualties were about 45,000 dead and 110,000 wounded. But the shocking thing wasn't the casualty figures, which were modest compared to World War I. The shocking thing was the speed, the totality of the defeat, the complete collapse of what everyone had thought was the strongest army in Europe. The Maginot Line had been made irrelevant not through frontal assault but through manoeuvre. The defensive firepower that had dominated World War I battlefields had been overcome through mobility and coordination. The secret wasn't German numerical superiority. The Allies actually had more tanks, more artillery, more troops. The secret was doctrine, organisation, and communication. German panzer divisions were designed for independent operation, with all necessary combat elements organic to the division. They had radios for coordination. Their commanders led from the front, making decisions on the spot rather than waiting for orders from higher headquarters. They understood that speed and shock were more valuable than careful preparation. They embodied a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, though the Germans themselves didn't use that term officially. It represented the solution to the tactical problems that had stymied World War I generals. Instead of trying to break through prepared defences with infantry assaults, you went around them with fast-moving mechanised forces. Instead of methodical advances on broad fronts, you concentrated overwhelming force at a single point, achieved breakthrough, then exploited deep into the enemy rear. Instead of waiting for supply lines to catch up, you kept moving, accepting risks, gambling that speed and shock would paralyse enemy response. But Blitzkrieg had limitations that would become apparent as the war progressed. It required open terrain suitable for mechanised operations. It required an enemy who would be psychologically paralysed by rapid advances and encirclements. It required complete air superiority to protect vulnerable armoured columns, and it required the ability to exploit breakthrough into enemy rear areas, which meant the enemy had to have rear areas to exploit. Against prepared defences in restricted terrain, or against enemies who wouldn't panic, or in the absence of air superiority, Blitzkrieg tactics could fail catastrophically. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 initially demonstrated Blitzkrieg at its most effective. 3 million German troops, 600 tanks, 700 aircraft, smashed through Soviet border defences and advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Soviet losses in the first 6 months exceeded 3 million prisoners, 20,000 tanks, and 21,000 aircraft. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. The Germans reached the outskirts of Leningrad, Moscow, and Rostov. By any rational calculation, the Soviet Union should have collapsed. But the Soviets didn't collapse. Partly this was due to their enormous reserves of manpower and resources. The Soviet Union could lose 3 million men and still field new armies. Partly it was because Soviet forces traded space for time, retreating rather than allowing themselves to be encircled, accepting territorial losses to preserve forces. Partly it was Stalin's brutal refusal to contemplate surrender regardless of losses, and partly it was because the Germans had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of warfare in the vast expanses of Russia. Blitzkrieg was designed for short campaigns in restricted geographic areas. Poland was overrun in 5 weeks, France in 6 weeks. These were campaigns where mechanised forces could reach strategic objectives before logistics became critical, But Russia was different. The distances were vast, the roads primitive, the weather extreme. German panzer divisions that had covered 50 miles in 4 days in France found themselves struggling to advance 10 miles per day in Russia. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of bad roads, or no roads at all. By December 1941, when German forces were stopped at the gates of Moscow, many units were at 50% strength or less, exhausted, low on ammunition and fuel, freezing in winter weather they were unprepared for. The Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945 represented warfare on a scale that made even World War I seem modest. The Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943 involved 2 million troops and produced nearly 2 million casualties. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history, with 6,000 tanks engaged across a front of over 100 miles. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million civilians from starvation and bombardment. The total Soviet casualties in World War II exceeded 27 million dead, more than all other nations combined. These weren't battles in the old sense, decisive engagements where one side won and the other lost. These were extended campaigns of attrition where both sides fed in reserves continuously, where the fighting raged for months, where victory went to whichever side could sustain losses longer. This was industrial warfare taken to its logical extreme. The Soviets could lose entire armies and replace them. The Germans could achieve brilliant tactical victories, encircle and destroy Soviet formations, advance hundreds of miles, and it didn't matter because the Soviets would simply raise new armies, and the Germans would be no closer to strategic victory. The Germans discovered, as Napoleon had discovered 130 years earlier, that Russia was simply too big, too populous, too resource-rich to be conquered by military force alone. The difference was that Napoleon had recognized this and retreated. Hitler refused to accept reality and kept fighting long after strategic victory was impossible, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in a futile attempt to achieve what the logistical and demographic mathematics made impossible. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were discovering their own solutions to the problems of modern warfare. The combined bomber offensive against Germany, launched in 1942 and intensifying through 1944, represented an attempt to break enemy resistance through strategic bombing rather than ground combat. The theory, developed by air power advocates between the wars, held that modern industrial economies were vulnerable to aerial attack. Destroy the factories, the rail networks, the oil refineries, and the enemy's ability to wage war would collapse. In practice, strategic bombing proved far less decisive than its advocates claimed. German war production actually increased through 1944, despite massive Allied bombing campaigns. The Ruhr Dam's raid in May 1943, immortalized as the Dam Busters Raid, was a tactical success that achieved minimal strategic impact. The bombing of Hamburg in July 1943 created a firestorm that killed 40,000 civilians but didn't significantly impact German military capabilities. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 killed another 25,000 and destroyed a historic city, but came too late to influence the war's outcome. What strategic bombing did accomplish was forcing Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense. By 1944, Germany was producing more fighters than bombers, more anti-aircraft guns than tanks, and had over 1 million personnel devoted to air defense. These were resources that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front or in France. The bombing campaign also devastated German transportation networks, making it increasingly difficult to move troops and supplies, and it provided invaluable experience in planning and executing large-scale military operations that would prove essential for the invasion of France. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented the culmination of military planning on an unprecedented scale. 5,000 ships transported 150,000 troops across the English Channel. 13,000 aircraft provided air cover and support. The invasion was preceded by months of deception operations to convince the Germans the attack would come elsewhere. It was supported by resistance movements sabotaging German communications and transportation. It embodied coordination between land, sea and air forces on a scale never before attempted. The landing succeeded despite fierce German resistance on some beaches. Allied casualties on D-Day totaled about 10,000, with 4,000 dead. These were heavy losses but far lighter than pessimistic predictions. The Germans, uncertain where the main attack was coming and lacking fuel and air cover, couldn't mount an effective counterattack. Within a week, the Allies had landed 326,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. A beachhead had been established, and the liberation of France had begun. But the campaign in France demonstrated that even in 1944, breaking prepared defences remained difficult. The Battle of Normandy lasted 2 months and cost the Allies 200,000 casualties before German defences finally collapsed in late August. The Germans, fighting from hedgerow country that favoured defence, inflicted losses that approached parity despite overwhelming Allied advantages in numbers, air power, and artillery. Only when Allied forces finally achieved breakthrough at the end of August did the German position collapse, leading to the liberation of Paris and the race across France. The race across France in late August and September 1944 briefly recreated the conditions of mobile warfare. Allied armoured divisions, led by generals like Patton who understood mechanised operations, advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, liberating vast territories, destroying German formations, reaching the German border by September. For a brief moment it seemed the war might end in 1944. But then logistics caught up with operations. The Allied armies were at the end of supply lines stretching back to Normandy. Fuel ran short. Ammunition became scarce. The advance stalled along the German border, giving the Germans time to establish new defensive lines. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the attempt to seize bridges in the Netherlands and cross the Rhine, demonstrated that even late in the war, overambitious operations could fail disastrously. Paratroopers landed behind German lines to seize key bridges, while ground forces raced up a single road to link up. The plan required everything to go right: perfect coordination, minimal German resistance, and quick movement by ground forces. Instead, the Germans reacted faster than expected, the ground advance was delayed by fierce resistance, and the airborne forces at Arnhem were isolated and destroyed. Over 15,000 Allied casualties for no strategic gain. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showed that even late in the war, even with overwhelming Allied advantages, the Germans could still achieve tactical surprise and initial success. German forces attacking through the Ardennes, the same route used in 1940, achieved complete surprise, broke through American lines, and advanced 50 miles before being stopped. The attack ultimately failed because the Germans lacked the fuel and air cover necessary to exploit their initial success. But it demonstrated that even in 1944, properly conducted offensive operations could succeed against unprepared defenders. By early 1945, the strategic situation was hopeless for Germany. The Soviets were advancing from the east, having pushed German forces back across Poland and into Germany itself. The Western Allies were advancing from the west, having crossed the Rhine in March. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited, reserves exhausted. Yet the German army continued fighting with fanatic determination, inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing Allies even as defeat became inevitable. The final battles in Germany demonstrated how far warfare had evolved from the early modern period. The Battle of Berlin in April 1945 involved 2.5 million Soviet troops, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces against perhaps 300,000 German defenders. The Soviets fired over 1.2 million artillery shells in the preliminary bombardment. Street fighting raged for 2 weeks. Soviet casualties exceeded 80,000 dead and 280,000 wounded. German military and civilian casualties exceeded 150,000. This was urban warfare on an industrial scale, block by block fighting with tanks, artillery and aircraft used to reduce each building to rubble. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the extent of the destruction was incomprehensible. 50 million dead worldwide, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Hundreds of cities reduced to ruins. Entire nations devastated. The USSR had lost 27 million people and suffered damage to 70,000 villages. Germany lost 7 million people and saw virtually every major city bombed to rubble. Poland lost 6 million, 17% of its pre-war population. Japan would lose another 3 million before surrendering in August, after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These casualty figures exceeded World War I despite lasting roughly the same duration. But the nature of the casualties had changed. In World War I, The vast majority of deaths were military personnel, soldiers in the trenches. In World War II, civilian deaths equaled or exceeded military deaths in many countries. This reflected the total nature of modern warfare, where entire economies and populations were mobilized, where strategic bombing targeted cities and industries, where partisan warfare blurred the line between combatant and civilian, where genocidal policies deliberately targeted populations for extermination. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 represented the ultimate evolution of warfare beyond anything conceivable in the early modern period. A single aircraft carrying a single bomb could destroy an entire city and kill 100,000 people. The destructive power that would have required months of conventional bombing could be delivered in seconds. The implications were profound and terrifying. Future wars between nuclear-armed powers could result in mutual annihilation. The traditional concept of military victory became meaningless if achieving it meant destroying your own civilization. The Cold War that followed World War II was shaped by nuclear weapons. The United States and Soviet Union, the two superpowers, possessed arsenals capable of destroying human civilization. Direct military conflict between them was unthinkable because it could escalate to nuclear war. Instead, they fought through proxies, through limited conventional wars in Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan, through political and economic competition, through arms races and space races and ideological struggles. But never direct military confrontation because the stakes were too high. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 demonstrated that even in the nuclear age, conventional warfare remained relevant. North Korean forces, armed and supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea in June 1950 and nearly conquered the entire peninsula. American-led UN forces intervened, pushed the North Koreans back, then advanced into North Korea themselves. Chinese forces then intervened, pushing UN forces back south. The front stabilized roughly along the original border and remained there for 2 years while negotiations dragged on. Korea was a limited war, fought with World War II-era weapons and tactics, but without the total commitment of World War II. Neither side was willing to risk escalation to nuclear war, so both accepted limitations. The Chinese threw human wave assaults against UN positions in tactics that would have been familiar to World War I generals. UN forces responded with firepower, artillery and airstrikes that inflicted horrific casualties but couldn't achieve decisive victory because the Chinese could replace their losses indefinitely. The final casualty figures for Korea exceeded 3 million, with over 40,000 American dead, perhaps 400,000 Chinese dead, and over 2 million Korean civilian deaths. The war ended essentially where it began, with Korea still divided. It demonstrated that even limited conventional wars in the nuclear age could produce massive casualties without achieving decisive results. The lessons went largely unlearned. Vietnam from 1965 to 1973 followed a similar pattern. American forces, equipped with helicopters and jet aircraft, precision-guided munitions and overwhelming firepower, fought North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces using guerrilla tactics and accepting losses that no Western military would tolerate. The Americans won virtually every major battle, inflicted casualty ratios of 10 to 1 or higher, bombed North Vietnam extensively, and still lost the war because military victory proved irrelevant when the enemy was willing to sustain unlimited casualties, and the American public wasn't. Vietnam demonstrated the limitations of conventional military power against an opponent willing to accept any level of casualties in pursuit of their objectives. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped by all sides in World War II. American artillery fired more shells than in any previous conflict. American forces killed millions of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. None of it mattered, because the North Vietnamese kept fighting, and eventually the American public decided the cost wasn't worth the objective. The pattern of limited wars continued through the rest of the Cold War. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 saw both sides using World War I tactics, human wave assaults and static trench warfare, producing 1 million casualties over 8 years while achieving essentially nothing. The Soviet War in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 saw a superpower defeated by guerrillas armed with relatively primitive weapons but possessing unlimited determination. The Gulf War in 1991 demonstrated that conventional military superiority could still achieve quick, decisive victory, with American-led coalition forces destroying the Iraqi army in 100 hours of ground combat after weeks of airstrikes. But the Gulf War also demonstrated how completely warfare had changed from the early modern period. Iraqi forces, the fourth largest army in the world, were destroyed by an enemy they rarely saw. Precision-guided munitions destroyed command centres and communications from beyond visual range. Helicopters and aircraft destroyed tanks before Iraqi crews could even identify targets. Coalition casualties totaled under 300 dead, against Iraqi casualties exceeding 25,000. The disparity reflected technological dominance so complete that the Iraqis were fighting a different war than their opponents. Modern warfare, as practiced by advanced military forces in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, bears almost no resemblance to early modern warfare. Battles are won by sensors and precision weapons, by satellite surveillance and computer networks, by forces that can strike from hundreds of miles away with weapons guided by GPS coordinates. Soldiers no longer stand in formation or charge fixed positions. They operate in small units with advanced communications, wearing body armour and night vision devices, calling in airstrikes and artillery from centralised control centres. The contrast with early modern warfare is absolute. Where early modern armies required close order formations and visual command, modern armies require dispersed forces and electronic communications. Where early modern weapons required closing to effective range measured in dozens of yards, modern weapons kill from miles away. Where early modern battles were decided by morale and discipline, modern battles are often decided before the enemy even sees their opponents. Where early modern warfare required months to mobilise and move armies, modern forces can deploy globally in days. Yet for all the technological sophistication, some fundamentals remain unchanged. Wars are still won by whichever side can sustain operations longer, can accept casualties longer, can maintain political will longer. Technology provides advantages but doesn't guarantee victory, as the Americans discovered in Vietnam and the Soviets in Afghanistan. Overwhelming firepower can destroy enemy forces but can't control territory or compel political capitulation, as demonstrated in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. The early modern way of war died in the trenches of World War I, killed by technologies that made its tactics obsolete. But the replacement wasn't some more enlightened or humane system. It was total war, industrial warfare where entire societies mobilized, where civilian and military targets merged, where casualties exceeded anything previously imagined. The progression from early modern warfare through World War I and II to modern limited wars and counterinsurgencies represents increasing technological sophistication, but not necessarily progress. More efficient killing remains killing. More precise weapons still destroy. Better communications don't prevent wars. The old way of war had its honour, its glory, its meaning, however illusory those might have been. Soldiers fought for king and country, for religious faith, for territorial aggrandizement. Battles had names and dates and clear outcomes. Generals were celebrated or condemned based on victory or defeat. Wars ended with treaties and territorial adjustments. The system was comprehensible even if brutal. Modern warfare has none of that clarity. Wars drag on, for years without clear objectives or definitions of victory. Enemies are insurgents or terrorists rather than uniformed soldiers. Battles are engagements or incidents rather than named clashes. The distinction between civilian and military, between war and peace, between victory and defeat, has blurred to the point of meaninglessness. We have more sophisticated weapons and more destructive capabilities than any previous generation, yet we seem no closer to understanding how to use military force to achieve political objectives or create lasting peace. The end of the old way of war wasn't progress, it was transformation, change without improvement, evolution without advancement. We replaced formations and fortifications with networks and satellites, muskets and cannon with missiles and drones, but we didn't replace war itself. We just made it more complicated, more expensive, more destructive, and somehow even more futile. The old way of war at least had the virtue of honesty. Armies met, fought, one side won, the war ended. The new way of war just continues indefinitely, consuming resources and lives in pursuit of objectives that grow hazier the longer the fighting continues.